He had merely brushed pasta-soft grays from the hem of his worn military jacket against the handlebar of a parked motorcycle, barely noticeable to anyone. But the burly man standing beside the Harley didn't see it as an accident. What he saw was an old man, silver-haired, moving slowly in a frayed army coating for him. That was reason enough to strike. No questions asked, no checking for damage, just one cold, resounding punch under the blazing Flagstaff sun. Veteran Franklin Hayes, 81, collapsed on the sidewalker's hand, still clutching the loaf of bread he'd just picked up from the neighborhood grocery store. No one spoke. No one moved. The crowd outside the bar just stood there, as if what had just happened was a scene from an old movie, and no one felt responsible for rewinding or intervening. A man who had once survived brutal war zones, who had repaired trucks under gunfire to get his brothers home safe, now lay alone on an American street, in the icy indifference of the very country he served. The bread had flown from his hands, the wrapping torn, pale slices now streaked with dust and motor oil. Mr. Frank didn't cry. He didn't lash out. He simply sat up slowly, trembling as he picked up each slice and placed it gently back into the shredded bag, as if it still held its worth. The silence around him wasn't reverence. It was the painful absence of humanity. No one knew that inside his left chest, pocket beneath the faded patch that read F. Hayes, was an old, battered phone. And with a single press, it would change that quiet afternoon forever. Franklin Hayes wasn't a well-known name in the town of Flagstaff. To most people, he was just an elderly man, silver-haired slender who showed up every Friday morning at the corner grocery store, where he'd buy a loaf of bread, a few cough drops, and occasionally a postcard for his grandson studying at the Air Force Academy in Colorado. No one knew much more, or perhaps no one had ever tried to. He moved quietly, like part of the town's background motion. Always there, rarely noticed. Mr. Hayes was 81 years old, a retired U.S. Air Force technician who had served 3 tours Afghanistan, Iraq, and finally Bosnia. For over 2 decades, he kept hundreds of war machines mission ready, not with a rifle, but with his hands, sweat, and a will that never broke. On his chest, the worn desert M65 jacket still bore the faded embroidery, F. Hayes, not for show, but as a thread of memory stitched to his identity. That morning was brisk. Frank pulled up his collar, holding a paper bag of bread. As he passed the lot outside the central bar, the hem of his coat brushed lightly against the handlebars of a gleaming Harley. The bike didn't fall, it wasn't scratched, it barely even shook. He immediately turned, raising a trembling hand. "I'm sorry, son," he said. "Guess this old coat's thicker than I thought." But kindness was no longer a common language. The bike rearly 30s, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing sunglasses, didn't respond. No questions, no hesitation. He slapped the old man across the face. The crack echoed beneath the noon sun. Franklin collapsed too slow to brace himself. The paper bag dropped, the bread burst out and scattered onto the oil-stained curb. He didn't groan. He didn't rage. He simply pushed himself up slowly, trembling, picking up each piece of bread like something sacred still worth saving. No one moved. A group of young men outside the bar burst into laughter, clinking beer cans, slapping hands like they just witnessed an expensive prank. A woman gently pulled her son to the other side of the street. A barista at a nearby cafe quietly drew the curtain shut. The silence wasn't shock, it was the paralysis of conscience. Frank stood up, shaking, steadying himself by gripping a lamppost near the bus bench. His cane had rolled away. He walked toward it, bent to pick it up, and let out a faint groan out from pain, but from the shame of being seen and yet ignored. It was a pain that left no bruise, but cut far deeper than any blow. Mr. Hayes had once risked his life to pull pilots out of burning F-16S. Today, he couldn't even ask for a napkin to wipe the blood from his lip. Franklin Hayes sat on the wooden bench at the bus stop, no more than 30 feet from where he'd just been struck. His back leaned gently against the railing, his hand clutching his cane like it was the last anchor, holding what little dignity he had left. On his lip, the blood had dried into a dark red streak, mixed with road dust and the heavy silence of a town too used to looking away. He didn't scan the street, didn't expect anyone to help. Years on the front lines had taught him how to read eyes, and not a single pair around him carried anything but avoidance. A teenage boy walked past, earbuds in, head buried in his phone screen. Frank raised a hand, a small, almost instinctive gesture, but the boy didn't see him. Or worse, he saw and chose not to. Frank wasn't angry. He didn't curse the world. What he felt was something more hollow, a particular kind of emptiness. The kind that comes when you've been erased from the very land you bled, sweated, and gave your best years to defend. Slowly, Frank slid his hand into his left jacket pocket. Not for a weapon, not for a warning. Just an old flip phone outdated a decade ago. Its screen was cracked, its buttons worn down, but it displayed a single name. Falcon 1, emergency only. No one knew who that was, but Frank did, and he knew with just one press, everything would change. He pressed it. A small beep sounded. No call, no message. Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket, leaned back, and waited. 15 minutes later, the ground began to tremble, faintly. Not enough for pedestrians to notice. But Frank, who'd once slept on the deck of a C-130 under enemy fire, felt it in his feet. A deep, steady vibration like the heartbeat of a storm rolling in. A man stepped out of the bar, squinting at the sky. From a distance, rotor blades began to echo across the blistering Arizona sky. Low, clear, unmistakable. Seconds later, a matte-painted UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter swept in low and clean, landing in the grassy patch behind the town center, less than 200 yards from where Frank was sitting. Right behind it, an unmarked military SUV rolled in like it had been summoned by code, tires whispering against the pavement before halting in place. The door opened. Tactical boots hit the ground synchronized. Silent. No orders needed. Frank didn't move, didn't flinch. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't hurried. He was just a father waiting for his son. The SUV stopped just as the Black Hawk's rotors kissed the ground. The door opened in perfect sync, like a movement rehearsed 1,000 times. 12 men stepped out desert tan tactical uniforms. No flashy insignia, no loud commands. But each step they took carried an invisible force, silencing the air around them, as if the entire town had been stripped of sound. From inside the helicopter, a single man descended. No sunglasses, no visible weapons. But even in silence, his gait alone made clear. He was the one in charge. Broad shoulders, decisive steps, eyes unwavering. Colonel Jackson Hayes, son of Franklin, commander of one of the U.S. CRUT, Air Force's elite special operations units. He didn't look around. He walked straight to the bus stop, where his father still sat quietly, one hand resting gently on his cane. Jackson stopped, not bowing, not raising his voice. He simply knelt down and gently wiped the dried blood from the corner of his father's mouth. "I came as soon as I could," he said. Frank said nothing, but their eyes met, and in that fleeting moment, nothing more needed to be said. One had given a lifetime, the other was ready to protect it, at any cost. Across the street, the laughter inside the bar died. Heads appeared behind windows. A few raised their phones, recording in silence. The biker one who'd slapped Frano took a step back, still wearing his leather jacket, but his arrogance was gone. He watched as the special ops unit formed a half-moon arc knot with raised weapons, but with a presence that straightened the spine of the guilty. As Jackson approached the bus stop, he hesitated just for a heartbeat. He'd seen horse bodies torn by landmines in Fallujah, brothers fallen beside burning wreckage in Kandahar, but never had he seen his father, Sergeant Franklin Hayes, sitting alone, dried blood on his lip, eyes reddened not with rage, but with fatigue. Jackson said nothing. There was no need to ask who did this. His father's silence had spoken louder than words. He knelt again, both knees touching the ground, not out of reflex, but like a sacred gesture. "I came the moment you called," he whispered, voice slightly trembling not from fear, but from fury buried deep in his bones. Frank simply nodded, a faint smile curling his lips, as if to say, "You're still just as fast as always." Jackson stood, turned, locked eyes on the biker, now shrinking behind a friend, as if trying to vanish into thin air. But the air around them had shifted. It was heavy, charged, like the seconds before a storm breaks. Asterisk, asterisk. Jackson stepped forward. Each stride was a statement. His boots made no sound, but their impact reverberated through every bystander's chest. Now face to face with the biker, Jackson didn't yell. He simply looked. "You hit him," Jackson said, his voice low and steady, like the thrum of distant rotors. "It was just a slap. That old guy scratched my bike," the biker started, voice faltering as Jackson's unblinking gaze locked on. "That slap," Jackson interrupted, "was something you thought you had the right to throw at a man who once repaired fighter jets under missile fire, just yards away from the blast zone. And," he paused, half a beat, his eyes never left the man's, "that man is my father. He doesn't need your respect. But you didn't just strike an old man, you struck history, sacrifice, everything you'll never understand, because you've never taken responsibility for anything greater than your shallow pride." The biker twitched, as if to speak, but Jackson took one step closer. Just one. No raised voice, no fists. But the space around him seemed to collapse inward. "If I hadn't shown up today," Jackson continued, "you'd still be standing there laughing, still bragging about how you put an old man in his place. But now, what have you learned?" He glanced back at his father, then returned his eyes to the biker. "You learned this. A tired old soldier may no longer stand tall, but behind him, there's always an army waiting for his signal." At that moment, 2 police officers approached. Jackson didn't need to point. They already knew. And for the first time, the biker said nothing. Not because he was forced to, but because, at last, he realized he had struck the wrong man. At first, no one knew what to do. They just stood there in that awkward, weighted silence after the last police officer shut the patrol car door and drove the biker out of sight. Franklin Hayes remained seated on the old wooden bench by the curb, both hands gripping his cane like it was the last thing anchoring what remained of his dignity. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, but they weren't looking at anyone in particular, as if he were staring through time, through years of service, through quiet sacrifices no one ever noticed. Inside the bar, the music had long stopped. The morning shift waitress, the same one who had turned away moments ago, gently pushed open the door, holding a white handkerchief tightly in her hand. Her steps were hesitant, but she didn't stop. As she neared Mr. Hayes, she bowed her head, eyes red-rimmed. I should have said something. I'm sorry," she whispered. Franklin looked up, took the handkerchief, and gave her a small nod. Just a nod, but it was enough to wake the street. A young man near the cafe removed his cap and held it to his chest. A father lifted his son onto his shoulders, whispering something into the boy's ear. A 10-year-old near the grocery store bowed slightly and raised his hand in a salute not perfect, but sincere. Then, one by one, people stepped forward. No shouting, no cheering. They weren't there to applaud. They came to correct what they had missed. Moments later, a middle-aged man in a worn flannel coat stepped forward, standing upright, eyes fixed ahead of former sailor. Beside him, a woman with short silver hair stood at attention, a retired Air Force officer. They didn't speak. They didn't introduce themselves. They simply stood, shoulder to shoulder, forming an unspoken line of honor, an invisible wall of gratitude. Jackson Hayes, Special Ops Commander, did nothing but step back, giving space to what was unfolding. His team stood still as well, silent. They understood. This moment didn't belong to them. It belonged to the man who chose to remain seated, and in doing so, made an entire town stand. The letter arrived on a Monday morning. No postmark, no return address, just a plain sheet of paper, handwritten in shaky, light blue ink. "If you're willing to meet me, I'm ready to listen." Franklin Hayes held the paper in his hands for a long time, saying nothing. He'd received far more serious letters in his life, these notices, deployment orders, injury reports, but something in the trembling handwriting made him pause. Not out of curiosity, but because something old within him stirred a familiar feeling when you see someone who hasn't completely lost themselves. 3 days later, in a small room at the city courthouse, there were no cameras, no reporters, no uniforms, just 2 men. Franklin entered slowly, no cane, yet carrying the quiet bearing of someone who had walked through war upright. Silent, alert. Sitting across from him was the young man who had knocked him to the pavement, a boy named Kyle, no longer in a leather jacket, just a wrinkled shirt, hands clasped like he was awaiting judgment. "I didn't know who you were," Kyle muttered, eyes darting away. If I had known That's the problem, Franklin interrupted, not harshly, but without softness. You didn't need to know who I was to treat me like a human being. Kyle swallowed hard. Silence stretched between them. Finally, he let out a breath and whispered, "My dad was a soldier. Vietnam. Came back. Broken. Drank. Hit. Went quiet. My whole childhood, a uniform, meant fear." Franklin nodded gently. "I knew men like your father. They lost too much, and no one ever taught them how to survive after the war. There were no moral lectures, no threats, no preaching, just a quiet space where truth could exist unjudged." From his pocket, Kyle pulled out a neatly folded paper-an application for mandatory counseling and a signed volunteer form for work at the local Veterans Center. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want to start over." Franklin didn't answer right away. He looked at the paper, then at the man before him, the one who had made him fall, now lowering himself in the most honest way possible. At last, Franklin placed his calloused hand over Kyle's and said, low but steady, "You won't make it right in a day. But if you show up every day not out of guilt, but out of a desire to do what's right maybe, you'll get closer." Kyle nodded, this time not hiding the tears. There were no cameras at that meeting, no audience, but it changed two people. And maybe, just maybe, it opened a narrow path where forgiveness doesn't erase the wrong, but lights the way toward redemption. 6 months later, the corner where Franklin Hayes once sat quietly had changed. Not loud, not flashy, just a bronze plaque mounted on a red brick wall, the inscription etched deep, in honor of Sergeant Franklin Hayes, the man who stood still in the chaos. Below it, a smaller line, but one that spoke louder than all. He never asked to be seen. He simply stood. Since that day, the small park behind the bar has been renamed Hayes Square. Children play there now. High school students stop by every Monday morning, laying flowers at the base of the stone. Not because they're told to remember, but because someone helped them see what's worth remembering. Franklin still returns each week, in his old jacket, worn out shoes. But now, a nod, a handshake. A respectful glance always meets him on the street. No one calls him a legend. They call him what he's always been, a quiet mirror of dignity and true strength. And Kyle, the man who once failed, now drives veterans to the VA center week after week. Silently, just like the man he once struck. No name tags, no declarations. The lesson here isn't about who was right or wrong. It's this. Sometimes the greatest strength lies in patience, in kindness, and in never giving up on anyone. If you believe respect shouldn't come only after pain, if you've ever met a Franklin Hayes in your life, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because this is where the quiet ones finally get heard.